gotta listen.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and a good friend of mine is about to start a Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 edition campaign setting, and it's been ages since I've dived into a good campaign, so I've been really excited, but it has brought up so many traumatic memories about, oh my goodness, how much fantasy, Dungeons & Dragons, including Dungeons & Dragons, gets wrong about the medieval period, historical armor, weapons and stuff like that. It's triggering stuff, it's really traumatic. And so kind of in response to me having to deal with this trauma, I felt a need to cover a subject I really haven't covered before, and that is what real historical armor not only looks like, but how it should function in fantasy role-playing. Because fantasy role-playing, it gets it wrong. It gets it wrong in design, and it gets it wrong in execution. So I'm gonna share what it should work like based on how these armors really react and function like historically and just in the real world, okay? Because modern recreations, tests and stuff like that, look, these armors are effective, wow. And so let's dive into that. Player's Handbook. Good old D&D 3.5 Player's Handbook. Why am I doing 3.5 instead of 5th edition? This is the version I'm most familiar with, the most version I've played. I say with my mates. My mates, this is our kind of, classic version of D&D. I said we might want to look at Pathfinder because Pathfinder is technically 3.5 improved there. I'm getting distracted, okay? Why do I have this book in my hand? Well, let me show you, right? So I jump to the chapter on equipment and have a look at the armor pictures. I'll come in closer, get a close look, and I hope you will throw up in your mouth a little bit by how just... Look. Sorry, I don't mean to criticize the artist who drew these. And did Todd Lockwood? No, I don't know. Todd Lockwood did a lot of the artwork for the 3.5 edition, and he is just a beautiful artist, actually. All right, here, I'll put up a scan of the armor depicted here, and you'll notice a kind of theme with fantasy armor, and it's the pieces, it's all piecemeal. It's all in like weird different plates segmented together and stuff, and this seems to be a running theme with fantasy armor design. Look at fantasy leather armor. Constructed out of separate, smaller plates everywhere. Fantasy, full plate armor, small, separate plates. Look, I think they're doing this because it looks cool. Real historical armor looks cool as well, okay? When it's done more realistically, you can fancify it a little bit with different proportions and the size and stuff, and it looks so much better. Well, like the piecemeal thing. People get hung up on that, and if it's the aesthetic thing why people want the piecemeal armor design and look, I really feel they can get easily as much fancy aesthetic design with more functional armor depictions. What is functional armor? Well, for one, when you make armor, it is better to have it out of as singular a plate as possible. Of course, movement, all right? You want to move, so it's not going to be one solid thing that you can't move in. So with movement, you need separation on those plates in the joint areas. But that's about it, okay? Because there's a problem with having armor made out of separate pieces, and that is there are gaps in between, even on overlaps between those plates, right? If you get a strong pointy thing right in between, you can get in between those gaps and hit them. So in every case, it is always far more functional. The armor works better when it's a solid plate rather than being made out of separate plates. And this is including leather. Leather armor and I, we have a bit of a long, sordid history. I don't like leather armor. I don't think it was very prominent historically. It did exist historically, but it wasn't very prominent in my opinion. Some people think it was more prominent. I don't think it was much at all. And I get so annoyed with the fantasy depictions of leather armor because not only is leather armor everywhere, like everyone is wearing it, it is usually this fantasy piecemealed crap, okay? And so I get so annoyed with it. Sometimes I've said to people, look, you're better off thinking leather armor didn't exist in the medieval period because that will save us from getting this crappy, horrible depictions and leather being misrepresented so much in every medieval fantasy, even medieval, stories, movies and stuff that are supposed to be in a historical period. Leather is everywhere. One of the more comprehensive videos I have on leather armor is my reply to some criticism people have put against me saying that, I say leather armor didn't exist and they did. And it's actually a good argument and discussion. And so it's a great video for you to get further viewing enjoyment out of if you want to dive into this subject a bit more. And that's really addressing how prevalent and prominent was leather armor in medieval history. All right, of course it existed historically. I don't think it was very prominent, but if you are still going to put it in a fantasy setting, because there might be situations in the fantasy setting that could make leather armor far more prominent than it was historically. One of the problems with history is how much time, how expensive it was, how much time it took to make. and also the availability of the right type of leather. Okay, so accessibility of leather is a problem. But in the fantasy setting, maybe leather far more available, then you can have leather armor. If you have leather armor, all right, the type of leather armor you would make is armor that is made out of full hardened plates of leather, not this piecemealed crap, okay? This is the way historical leather armor might have looked like in the medieval period. Basically, you would almost make its design nearly identical to metal plate armor, full plate armor. The same, you know, plate segments, okay, the same joint division and stuff like that, just out of leather. Some of the kind of small, there's not many points of evidence for leather armor in the medieval period, but some of these points of evidence that people point to, interestingly, are plates of leather that have been added as part of metal armor as kind of an addition or a separate section to it. And so interestingly, leather armor might have been less prominent in the medieval period because perhaps it was rarely full leather armor, but only parts of the armor that was leather. And there's a difficulty with identifying. But anyway, if you're adding in leather armor to a fantasy setting and you want it depicted realistically, it's going to look basically like plate armor except made out of leather plates instead of metal plates. That's it. This piecemeal junk, get rid of it. There are problems there. And the other thing that really does me, I'm getting on a leather armor rant, right, is the type of leather that you see depicted in so much fantasy, especially like, you know, movies, TV shows, fantasy stuff like that. The leather is this flimsy, light, you know, not wafer thin, hyperbole, right? But it's this really light material that's thin and easy to, it's like biker leather. That's not going to stop spit, all right? That's not going to protect you. This armor is absolute junk. If you're going to make armor out of leather, it's going to be hardened leather plates, really stiff and rigid. And the next egregious thing about, and of course it's in D&D, studded leather. Holy crap, studded leather is the biggest bullcrap, and I resent it so, like, one of the reasons why I get really triggered by this is studded leather is some of the most protective light leather that you can get in Dungeons and Dragons, in so many versions, okay? It goes padded armor, and I'm gonna get to padded armor because I have a lot to say on that subject. Well, maybe not a lot, maybe I'm just more passionate about how it's underrepresented and it is insulted. Padded armor is insulted by how it is represented in the statistics and rules of so many role-playing games. But anyway, this is the first entry-level armor, and it's like only +1 armor. Like, come on, right? And then you get leather, and then studded leather. Studded leather seems to be the best out of the really cheap, organic kind of leather materials. And then chain shirt, just a chain hauberk, really, is the highest kind of armor that you can get in the light armor category. All right, chain shirt, you know, that's handled mostly all right, except the pictures. Like, but for some reason, having studs on leather makes it far more protective than not. Studs. I mean, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, see the studs? Studs are everywhere. You could add them for aesthetics, make it, if you like the look of all these studs, but protection, the chances that a sword strike is going to land straight on a stud and the stud will protect the strike is so small, and even if it does land, it's going to glance off and then go onto the leather anyway, okay? Studded leather is so stupid. One of the reasons where we kind of assume, us, you know, medieval Puritan snobs like myself, assume the idea of studded leather comes from is actually a historical armor called Brigantine. Now, Brigantine is actually metal armor. It's a type of plate armor, and if you want to incorporate it into a fantasy, D&D, whatever, it would be basically plates. Let me just check what type of armors, because they have like half plate. I mean, but breastplate and stuff. I love Dungeons and Dragons, by the way. It might not seem like it. It's a fun game, okay? But if you've seen many of my videos on fantasy, like I rag out the idea of classes, I've ragged out the idea of levels, and I've ragged out the ideas of dungeons. What about dragons? Dragons seem to be the only thing I love in Dungeons and Dragons. No, look, there are issues I have with it, but that doesn't mean it's not a fun game. And all right, so Splint mail. Their picture of Splint mail is trash. Banded armor. How do they describe banded armor here? I like. Who rarely uses Splint or Banded? These are like the armors you only get if you have nothing else, okay? You find it on a corpse or whatever. It's like, well, I don't have full plate yet, so I'll just like, these are throwaway armors because of their statistics that no one ever uses. Where in reality, like, you know, proper good Splint armor, it's pretty good. And there are some instances you might want to wear it instead of plate, okay? Well, actually, plate is pretty awesome. If you have the option for plate over other armor, you're generally always, so maybe they got that kind of feeling right in Dungeons & Dragons, because historically, yeah, if you could get plate, you would wear plate. But there are different types of plate, all right? Banded. This armor is made of overlapping strips of metal sewn to a backing of leather. A backing, not a facing of leather, it's a backing of leather. Leather and chainmail. The strips cover vulnerable areas while the chain and leather protects the joints and provide freedom of movement. More freedom. This is the other, getting into the statistic things. Technically, you have as much freedom of movement in plate, maybe even more in some instances, because plate is properly dispersed, it's made to articulate everywhere. Then armor, then even say, if you have a leather, like a full leather arm thing, and it's stiff and it's hard and it isn't made to have segmented joints properly, that leather joint is going to be stiffer than you could actually feel in plate armor, because plate is made to articulate really well. So the restriction of movement thing that people really bring up with metal armor can be overemphasized. I'm not saying it's like you're wearing nothing. It's obviously got more weight than if you were wearing nothing, but still, got to get in the right context here. Anyway, so there's a lot of throwaway armors and different armors, and it doesn't look like Brigantine is there at all. And Brigantine is awesome. It should easily have as much protection as full plate, depending, because Brigantine is mostly a breastplate type of armor that was then combined with other kind of segment joints of armor, leg armor, hand armor, and if you have a helmet, it should have about the same protection as full plate. So if you want to incorporate it, and even if your dungeon master or whoever is running the game isn't allowing it, you just say, all right, I'm going to have full plate, but it's going to look this way, or I'm going to pretend that it looks this way, and it's Brigantine. And so what Brigantine is, plates like riveted onto either cloth or leather facing on the front, and that holds the plates in place. And you might be saying, aha, this is plated armor. You're right, all right? There are historical examples of armor made out of individual smaller plates, but when they have the option of just a full, plate section without segmented parts, they go with that because it's more protective. There's less chance of strikes landing in between, all right? And what's interesting about this, historically, when there was armor made out of segmented plates, it was behind something. So coat of plates and Brigantine, that was behind something that covered, the joint section. So someone who's attacking the person in this armor can't see where the joints are, so it's far more difficult to get a blade right in between those joints because you can't see where the segments of these plates overlap. So there we go. There's logic as to why there was a facing instead of a backing for this type of armor. But Brigantine on the surface can look like leather with studs. Studded leather. Yeah. People have misunderstood it. Obviously, this is metal armor, but that's where we think studded leather comes from. Studded leather is just trash. Get rid of it. All right, so what about armor protection values? Well, this is the thing, right? Armor was made to protect people. And so, say, look at the light armor category, where padded armor is just treated like trash. Gambeson is the padded armor, essentially, in many role-playing games. Gambeson is easily as protective as leather armor, if not more in some circumstances. I have a whole video of Gambeson versus leather armor. Now, there are circumstances in which Gambeson, because it's not invulnerable, Gambeson isn't as good as, say, mail. You have to understand, mail was worn with a thinner layer of gambeson underneath, but it can be worn with a thicker gambeson underneath. I guess it would be personal preference, but if you have a full thick gambeson and mail over top, you're going to get a bit of, restrictive movement there, I'll grant it that. And if you don't want it to be so bulky, the gambeson underneath will be thinner, but there's still gambeson. There is still an additional protective layer under mail. So when people say mail is universally better than gambeson, that is because there is gambeson generally underneath. Thinner, but it's still there. So it kind of can combine those properties. And in that sense, it makes sense that mail would be better than gambeson. But in terms of the relation between gambeson and leather, far more comparable, and in my opinion, gambeson easily is good. So if we were to look at Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, gambeson should be +3 armor. Easy. And leather should be +3 armor, and there would really be no armor less than that. If you want to really incorporate maybe a thick woolen coat, perhaps, or maybe just regular clothing can actually stop cuts at times, okay? So there you go. Clothing perhaps should at least give +1 armor, and studded leather armor should be thrown into the abyss of everyone's minds and just... Let's try and forget it, because, gosh, it gives me depression, that thing. But that's if we were restricting ourselves to the protective value that Dungeons & Dragons assigns to, say, gambeson and light armors, where in reality, if I'm trying to convey the scale, what is +3 versus the best type of armor that they can give, which is on full plate, which is +8? Is gambeson less than half as effective as full plate? Well, no, not in my opinion. Like, Gambeson can be quite effectively protective, more so than people realize. If I was to give an honest, this is opinion, you can interpret differently. I'd actually be interested in hearing your thoughts in the comments below, because of course I'm not familiar with every single role-playing rule set, and so I'm giving the example of D&D 3.5 because I'm getting back into it, right? Hopefully you can take what I'm saying here and perhaps translate it to your own role-playing games, especially if you're game masters, dungeon masters, all right? Do the right thing here, okay? Represent armor properly, especially good old Gambeson, okay? Do true justice to the medieval period here, people. And Gambeson, on its protective scale, I would probably give at least 4 or 5. I could almost be pushed, no, maybe 6 or 7 would be male. There's a couple of other things, okay? This is getting a bit more in depth, but this is important, right? Dungeons & Dragons, how armor functions, and again, you'll need to translate this to your own, fantasy settings and whatever games you're playing. Armor functions in Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, and I'm assuming this is like 5th edition as well, in a system of likeliness to hit, okay? It assigns a greater difficulty to strike and do damage, but that's not how armor works. Not in every circumstance, okay? There are some circumstances where you strike the armor and you hit a resistance level of the armor that you need to get through to actually do damage. But that is actually a completely different mechanic according to Dungeons & Dragons system. It's technically, in reality, a type of damage reduction instead of actual what it is covering on your body. If armor was only valued in a system of low armor, means it's only slightly harder to actually strike and do regular damage, that would mean the armor is only covering perhaps 10-20% of someone's body. And there are ways to get around the armor, because as soon as you get around the armor, you do damage to the person as if the armor doesn't even exist. That's dumb. That's not realistic. That's not how actual real armor works. Armor was made to protect most of the body. Like Gambeson, granted, legs are vulnerable, but the arms are striking the legs is much harder than people think in actual real combat, okay? Generally in real combat, you would only be striking for the legs or hit a strike if you were actively aiming for it. Most strikes would be upper body, arms, and maybe thigh area, but the thighs are generally protected on Gambeson. There's a lower, maybe lowered knees, insert take an arrow to the knee memes in the comment section below, and shins, feet area. Those areas are much harder to strike, so the Gambeson technically does give a measure of full body protection. Thighs, chest, body, arms, and if you're wearing a helmet, and helmet should always come with armor, yeah, full body protection in that sense. And so having a chance to slip past the armor and do regular damage, it's unrealistic, because if you strike the armor and strike through the armor and then hit the actual person, that strike is not going to have nearly as much energy as it would have had if it struck someone who was wearing no armor at all. But in Dungeons & Dragons, if you exceed their armor class, or whatever it is, to actually hit them, you do full damage. So in actual fact, it would be far more realistic if armor functioned on a damage reduction system than a likelihood to actually hit the person system, which is what D&D does function under. And so Gambeson and leather armor, not studded leather armor, just regular leather armor, which would be as effective as studded if studded leather exists, but it shouldn't because it's just stupid. They should have, say, a damage reduction value of 10, okay? And it can vary with magical materials and stuff like that. And plate armor, or we'll go to male. Male, damage reduction 15. It's funny, male is, perhaps you would have differences between types of attacks, because every weapon is given a damage type, bludgeoning, slashing, or piercing, and in all honesty, the type of weapon plays differently against the type of armor. If you really wanted to be specific on, and it could get too complex because sometimes you want things streamlined, but if you want things realistic, bludgeoning, like Gambeson should have 15 damage reduction against bludgeoning. Leather, not so much. I think leather would probably still say around the 15. And when we come to mail, this is the interesting thing. Mail should have about the same damage reduction value against bludgeoning as, say, Gambeson does, in my opinion, but the damage reduction value against slashing weapons, mail is phenomenal against slashing. It should have a damage reduction of 30 against slashing weapons. That's how it should function. This is realistic armor, if it was depicted in the rules properly, that's how it should work. Piercing, okay, would be far more comparable to Gambeson. Maybe it's a little bit above, so Gambeson, if its damage reduction value is 10, male should have 15. Sorry if I'm getting technical here, but this is how you should incorporate the rules. If you want armor to function realistically, it should have damage reduction. If it does, and so, do you even know what damage reduction is? It's kind of self-explanatory. Any damage you hit, the damage is, the damage reduction subtracts from the damage. So if you're only doing, say, 9 damage, and they have damage reduction 10, you do no damage, the armor did its job, it protected you, and it wasn't damaged, and that's actually really cool. That's great how it is incorporated and how it should function in the rules. And when it comes to plate Plate should have like a damage reduction value of like 30 or 40 flat. Plate is phenomenal. You cannot strike through it. And so this is where perhaps trying to strike in the open areas of armor, like where the armor class value can come back into play. But the armor class value, striking in an open area on armor so you can avoid the damage reduction penalty, should be pretty darn high, because it is hard to avoid it, and it should be really high for every armor. Gambison covers most of the body. Mail, especially a big mail hallbook, that covers the legs, and if they have, you know, leg protection and hand protection of mail as well. The armor class value, which reflects how difficult it is to avoid the armor and just do direct damage, should, on like Gambison, mail and stuff like that, should be like a flat plus 10 or 11, and your standard armor value is 10 in just if you're not wearing armor, so that means your standard armor class, if you're wearing like even Gambison, should be like 22 in my opinion. Really hard to get around and avoid the armor. And plate, something like plus 15. Yeah, 25. That sounds realistic, because your average slob who picks up a weapon, has no training, it's not going to be able to jam a good strike in between the joints unless they get remarkably lovely, like a natural 20 roll. And then if you're actually trained, and look, will this make plate OP in the rules? Yes, because plate was OP historically. This system of rules would make armor function far more realistically and in a far more comparable way to how armor functioned in history in the real world. Okay, so if you want that addition, if you want that gritty realism in your role playing, pick up an adaptive rule set like this.
And then you could add circumstantial rules based on situation. For instance, if someone wearing full plate armor is knocked off their feet, they're prone, they lose their armor class completely. You know, that difficulty value that prescribes how hard it is to avoid the armor and do direct damage and not be restricted by damage reduction? This would mean combat in role-playing games would actually start to mirror historical combat quite a lot, because the best way to fight someone in full plate armor now would be to immobilize them, knock them off their feet, and now you can avoid that armor by stabbing them through the eye slit. Everything else is just like trying to bash someone in a metal drum that does barely any damage unless they're using specialized weapons made to fight armor, which perhaps halves the damage reduction value on that armor dependent on the type of weapon. Full plate armor that has a regular damage reduction value of 30 only has a damage reduction of perhaps 10 against a poleaxe. Gambison, which might have a damage reduction value of 10, could have a damage reduction of only 5 against a falchion, because the falchion, with how it is uniquely made, is exceptionally good against linen armor and flesh.
And Dungeons & Dragons, if Wizards of the Coast are watching this, okay, pay attention. Like, it wouldn't be wonderful if Wizards of the Coast made like an additional variant or a rule book or something like that called like Dungeons & Dragons Medieval Realism or something like that. Tweet Wizards of the Coast this video. Maybe we can get something going, right? Or in the later edition of D&D, they'll incorporate realistic, realistic representations of how both weapons and armor function in their rule set, because at the moment, they do not. Now, my DM, champion of a guy, is also my accountant, as a matter of fact, and really good accountant as well, by the way. Awesome guy. I'm not sure he's going to take out these rules. He loves the rules as written in the books, and so I can't fight it. I can't. This is why. Look, I played D&D with these rules for a long time. I'll just have to try and survive. I hope I've given you a lot to think about though, okay? This is how armor really should be represented like visually in fantasy, and how much more effective armor really should be, and how, if you want to make it represented in the rules more realistically, this is how the rules should work. So, something to think about. Try and adapt these ideas to any other role-playing game you're playing outside, but armor really should work on a damage reduction system. So, basic armor gives a damage reduction value, and a chance of avoiding the armor if there's a way to attack like that. Look, I'm repeating myself, but there we go. I think it's actually, that would work really good. I love to play a system that incorporated armor in this way. So thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. Thank you for letting me rant on. And I'm in the middle of making my character for D&D. I'm thinking of going a Duskblade from the Player's Handbook number 2. 3.5 has so many expansion modules that the game is just broken. But if I can break the game and do an OP power build because it allows me, if the rules allow me, you can't blame me. But anyway, my DM is probably watching here and he'll be like, all right, Duskblade, disallowed. Only 3 core rule books. Take that, shut it down. Dang it. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope to see you next time. Until then,